Well, good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. Tonight's topic is going to be on the topic of suffering, and this is a live show. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them, and I will respond to them, or at least attempt to respond to them. And I'm a member of the North Columbus Church of Christ. We are in Columbus, Mississippi, and our website is northcolumbuschristians.com. There you can find out more about us. Our meeting times, we meet Sundays 9, 10, 11 a.m., and Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. And we'd certainly love for you to come visit and ask questions about the things we do, about what we teach. And we always strive to teach only those things are in the scriptures. So tonight's topic is going to be on the topic of suffering, or rather the problem of suffering. And it is it's a good question. Why do we see so much suffering in the world? And why, and we're going to look at a few questions, why does God allow suffering? And it's a good question, and it's a problem that people take issue with, and this idea of suffering is an argument for those that don't believe in God. And so, going on to our first slide, if you can see this is a quote from a movie called The Matrix. And so there was a three-movie series, and of course they made a fourth Matrix movie very recently. But I can't remember whether this was in the second or third movie. But the main character here meets this character called the Architect. And if you're familiar with the basis of the Matrix movies, it's where people are basically controlled by machines, and they are, essentially enslaved by machines, but they're hooked up into what's called the Matrix, which is basically a computer simulation, to where even though the machines in reality are in complete control with the majority of humanity, humanity are they are their brains are in this sort of simulation, and so they think that they are in quote reality, when in actuality they are not. And this architect is it's a human embodiment of a computer program, and this architect was in charge of building matrices, and he explains to the main character how there was multiple matrices built before the main character came along. And this quote, it says that the first matrix I designed was quite naturally perfect. It was a work of art, flawless, sublime, a triumph equaled only by its monumental failure. The inevitability of its doom is as apparent to me now as a consequence of the imperfection inherent in every human being. Thus, I redesigned it based on your history to more accurately reflect the varying grotesqueries of your nature. Then he goes on, talks about the idea of choice, so on and so forth. And you may ask, Evan, why are you bringing this quote in? Well, think about what he's saying here. He says that the people did not accept it because originally he, the architect of, designed this matrix as perfect, or as he would assume what perfection would be. And people did not accept it. And so he had to add what he said, these grotesqueries of your nature. He had to redesign it based on the history of humanity and what is history of humanity. It's a lot of suffering involved in that. And so, with this perfect matrix, people just thought that there was something that just wasn't right, and they just didn't feel right. They wouldn't accept it. And so, I use this to illustrate that this idea of suffering is really ingrained in our nature. That this is something that's a part of us, is a part of this world, and it's to the point where if things are going well, or we would say quote too well for long periods of time, people can start getting suspicious. For example, if you have kids and the kids are out playing and all of a sudden they become quiet, normally you would assume that it's not, well, they're just acting right, being peaceful, and maybe I can get some rest now, whatever it may be. It's not that. You immediately think to the worst, that they're up to no good, and you go and find out what they're actually doing. And so we can see how it's uh, we're not accustomed to this world of just absolutely no suffering. This we are accustomed to it, and so for suffering in the Bible, it's everywhere. You think from the very beginning, Adam and Eve, the sufferings that were the consequences of what they have done, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Cain and Abel, Cain murdering Abel, the suffering of Abel, of Joseph, the suffering that he faced because of his brothers and their jealousy. You look at the book of Psalms, I read where there's around a third of the Psalms are actually laments. You think about what some the Psalms talk about: sin, repentance of sin, this anguish over the circumstances in the writer's lives. You think about Job, well known, and the sufferings that he faced, and it wasn't even his fault. And Jesus, of course, Jesus and his sufferings. We think about what he suffered on the cross, and what what was the purpose of that suffering as well. And then also we think about the apostles and their sufferings in Acts and throughout the New Testament. It's recorded that we don't have most of their deaths are not recorded in the New Testament, but secular history records that just about all of them were martyred because of their faith. And so suffering is evident. Of course, we see it's evident in our world as well. But why? That's a good question. Many ask, why would a loving God allow suffering? And it's a perfectly normal question to ask. And some see suffering as a retribution for sins. One of Job's friends in chapter 4, verse 7 through 9, I believe was Eliphaz. He basically said that the reason Job was suffering was because there was some sin that was in his life that he hadn't repented of, and that God is punishing him for this sin. He deserved this punishment. And of course, we see that in today's world. A lot of people talk about this idea of karma, that when something bad happens to somebody, it may or may not be because of what they would call karma, and they were just getting they're just getting retribution for the things in which they have done wrong. And is that the case? Does the Bible teach that every time someone sins, when something bad happens to somebody, it's as a result of their sins. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then others use suffering as proof that God does not exist, and we'll talk about that, and that's really not a good argument. That this idea that this God, because He does not intervene directly in our lives and allows bad things to happen to good people, well, that is proof that He does not exist, because this suffering or His allowance of the suffering would be outside of His character. Okay, and so is that a legitimate argument? We'll talk about that as well. So where does suffering come from? And ultimately, we see that suffering begins in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. And we see here that because they sinned, they did those things which God had commanded them to not do. They were deceived by Eve was deceived by the serpent, and then Adam was basically persuaded by his wife. And we see the consequences of that. To the woman, there was pain in childbirth. Your desire should be for your husband. The husband was going to rule over him. To Adam, that basically saying you're going to have to work, that you're going to have to, work to grow your food, and the soil is going to bring forth thorns and thistles. It's going to be hard work. It says, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. And we see that that's continued. That those consequences continued throughout time. Everyone knows the pain of a woman's childbirth. Men continually have to toil and sweat to produce food and the things which are necessary for survival, and that's continued on. But recognize that suffering came from sin. And this is what it was caused by. It wasn't because God said, "Well, I'm going to just make these people work. I'm going to make these people sweat, make them have a hard life." It was because of their sin, and it was a direct consequence of their sin. And man was tempted by his own desires. When that serpent tempted Eve, what did he say? He said that basically saying that it was going to cause her to be like God, knowing the difference between good and evil, and she liked evidently she liked what he was saying, and she saw that fruit was good, and so she had those desires, and she was tempted by those desires. And James 1 and verses 13 to 15 says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death." Now recognize that the serpent started this process. He was the one that was bringing forth or just kind of putting that seed in Eve's head. But recognize that at the end of the day, Eve was responsible for her own sin. The serpent didn't make her do this. She was tempted. Those desires aroused within herself, and then she was tempted, and she gave in to that temptation. And so again, God did not tempt them, and they did it of their own volition, and they sinned. And so now the consequences of that sin. And we see that this suffering and this sin is, just apparent in our lives today. And much of suffering continues to be caused by sin. We have a few charts up here that looks at murder rates, car thefts, of those committing adultery as well. And think of the suffering that is caused by these, just these few things. The suffering of the families or families of these murder victims and these car thefts, or just stealing in general. And we also think about those affected by those that commit adultery, and the children, and the immediate family that is affected by them. And so, if people did not choose to sin, much of this suffering would go away. A lot of it is as a result of sin. But some suffering is not caused by sin. And of course, some may say, well, that's crazy. What do you mean by that? Well, you think about Job. Was his suffering caused by sin? Some thought that it was caused by sin. Job 4, verse 7 through 9, we just talked about this verse. It was Eliphaz saying that, he says, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? And he says, ever as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same, by the blast of God they perish, and the breath of his anger they are consumed. Look what he's saying here. He says, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. So if you, Job, are reaping this trouble, it's because you plowed it. It's because you sowed it. You were doing those things, and now it's just coming back on you. We recognize that's not the case. We recognize that ultimately it was Satan wanting to really tempt Job to curse God, to rebel against God. And that didn't work. And so it wasn't caused by Job's sin. John 9, it says, now Jesus passed by. He saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. And so you have the story of Job, but apparently these Jews still had this idea that when somebody was born with some illness or something bad happened to somebody, it was a result of someone's sin. And this is this question. They were wanting to know who sinned. Was it the man who sinned, or was it the parents who sinned? And as a result, this man was blind. Notice Jesus' response. Nobody sinned. This man nor his parents sinned, but what was the purpose of that? It says, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Notice this there was a direct purpose for this, and that this person would ultimately be healed by Jesus. And so this was actually good came out of this, and that they could recognize by this miracle that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was who he was claiming to be, the Son of God. Now, in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 11, it's an interesting passage here. It says, I return and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. It's very interesting, and it really goes against this idea of that, God is just directly intervening in every little detail in our life. And this writer is saying that these things in our lives, just there's a lot of things that don't go as they should. Good things will always happen to good people, and bad things will always happen to bad people. It says the race is not to the swift. Those that would be expected to win don't win. And he says ultimately, time and chance happen to them all. We have to recognize that sometimes that our suffering is not linked to any type of sin or to any wrongdoing on our part. It was just really just chance that caused these things to happen to us. We have this saying of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and sometimes that is the case. And the writer here is talking about that they're just things that happen that we have no control over, and that we have to really just have to endure. And so, moving on from that, think about this idea of is suffering only bad? There's something, this is another point that I'd like to talk about is immediately when people talk about suffering, is they always assume that 100% everything associated with it is bad. Okay. And that's kind of a starting point, at least for the atheist, is saying, well, since God allows this suffering and suffering is bad, well, then God must be bad. And really, the problem is that the atheist can accept that God is bad. And so, well, therefore, he just doesn't exist. And so, is this correct thinking? Is this a logical thought? Well, you know, we see in Hebrews 5 verses 7 through 9, it says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him, he was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Look at what was accomplished through Jesus' suffering, okay? He learned, well, for him, he learned obedience. Okay. But what was in it for us? For us, the things that he suffered ultimately resulted in making our salvation possible. Having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. All right. So his suffering allowed us to be saved. And the suffering was good for him as well because he was able to learn obedience. And he was really able to, and I think what that means is him being in the flesh, is he really understood what it meant to be human. And he really understood what it meant to be tempted and to endure that temptation. And he truly, really learned what it meant to be obedient to God through that. And he suffered, it says. And so there was good that resulted in those things. Hebrews 12, verse 3 and through 11, we won't look at it, but it talks about the chastening of God. And ultimately, this discipline that believers can face, what is the result of it? Was much like a parent disciplining their children. It's to make them grow, mature. The scriptures say, I believe it says that you ultimately may be partakers in his holiness. This discipline allows us, again, to grow, mature, to acquire those characteristics that God would want us to have, and to, really get better in a lot of things. Philippians 1 and verse 12 through 14, it says, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." Look at what happened because of Paul's suffering. Okay. And Paul didn't just sit here and say, "Oh, this woe is me. This is the worst thing ever." Notice his perspective on this. That, okay, I'm in chains, but these things actually happen for the furtherance of the gospel. That people, the palace guard, knew that his chains was in Christ. So it was a great impact on those that were actually guarding Paul. But we also see that brethren became more emboldened by him being in chains, and so they were more bold to speak this word. Okay, and so good came from his suffering as well. Romans 8 and verse 17 says, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we also may be glorified together." All right. So how do we become heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ? Well, if we indeed suffer with him. Much of the New Testament talks about the idea of being like God, being like Christ, imitating him. And so if we're striving to be like Christ, the things that happen to Christ are more likely going to happen to us. Okay. And so if he suffered, we can expect to suffer. All right. And so we're going to be heirs of God, heirs of joint heirs with Christ if we suffer with him, if we or act like him, we do the things that are commanded. And if there's any persecution, anything of that, any type of hardship, we endure those things with him just as he endured them as well. And what's the end result? That we may be glorified, that we may be heirs. And so we're going to have that eternal home in heaven if we endure those things. All right. And so again, what is our perspective? And it's dishonest to sit there and say that only bad comes from suffering. There's a lot of good that comes from suffering, and there's a and I think of the question of what would happen if all suffering was removed. Okay, what would happen to us if all suffering was removed? Okay, would we strive to follow Christ, or would we strive to follow God? Would this hope of salvation mean as much to us if all bad things in our lives would remove? Would that be the case? And I certainly think that it would be detrimental to us if all suffering was removed. All right. Have another question here on the screen. If God is evil for allowing suffering that is bad, what if He did not allow suffering that is beneficial? Think about that. And I think any suffering that we endure, I think there is some good that can always come out of it, no matter how bad it is. There's something that we can grow in. Maybe it's patience or whatever it may be. Uh, there's something good that can come out of it. And so, if all suffering was removed, we would not have those benefits. Okay, and so if God is evil for allowing this bad suffering, what is He if He denies us these benefits of this suffering? Just something to think about. Again, I already asked this question, but what would happen to us if all suffering is removed? All right. I think we would just, we, I think, I think about people that they have plenty of money, they have no need for money, and what there's their attitude? What is their attitude? There's just, their life is meaningless. They become very depressed because they have all this money, and it's just something that happens to them. And I think that would be much like if we just had all suffering removed, that we would just become, quote, fat and happy. And I say that very lightly. And we wouldn't seek God. We would only seek our own desires. So the argument of the atheist, and I recognize that this is a problem for a lot of people. This idea that how can this God who you claim to be loving allow all these things, bad things, to happen? And I've dealt with some of them, and there's good for that comes out of this suffering, and I think it's uh, I don't think it's the right mentality to ask God to remove all those things from us because there's benefits that we have. But when you think about this idea of just what is suffering, how do we determine what is suffering? And some of you may have heard this argument in a similar manner in regards to um, this idea of God allowing evil in the world. And so the question is asked is, well, or they would use this idea of evil to disprove God. Well, the problem with that is you have to have some objective standard to determine what is evil. And so here you have to have some objective standard to determine what is suffering. And so where do we get that standard? Who am I? Just like the just like it would be illegitimate to just say, well, uh, I have the authority to dictate what is evil or not. And that's who gives you that authority? Nobody gives you that authority. There has to be some ultimate starting point to where that moral standard begins. And of course, it has to begin with God to determine what is evil. And just like this, how do we determine what is suffering? Okay. Well, how do we determine what is bad, what is painful, so on and so forth, without some objective standard? And much of that is tied in with this idea of knowing what is good and what is evil. And it's hard for us to really conclude that something is bad or wrong if there's no objective standard, and that standard has to come from some higher being than ourselves. Because who is the arbitrator on earth that determines these things? What human has that authority? I know I don't. No, nobody. There's definitely nobody that I would trust on this planet to determine, to be the sole source of right or wrong. And so is the evidence of suffering all that is needed to disprove God? I think that's it's not a very good argument. And again, we talked about suffering for what is good, suffering for what is bad. There's a lot of good things that are in this world, and I think there's a lot more good than there is bad in this world. And so, if the bad disproves God, what do we say about all the good? That it's just it just happens spontaneously, and so it's illegitimate to sit there and ignore all the good in this world and then come around and say, well, all this bad all the bad is bad, and so because of that, God must not exist, because how can a loving God allow those things? Well, He does a lot of things for us that is good. Does the goodness in the world prove or disprove God? And again, if the suffering disproves God, we come into the problem of what does the goodness do? And it's just kind of conundrum for us there at that point. And so, in conclusion, God recognized that God does allow suffering, but there is good that comes from suffering. And there's and I think it's a problem of perspective of this idea of just saying, well, there's nothing good that can come out of suffering. And I would challenge all of us to sit here and think about, no matter what bad things may happen in my life, what is something good that can come out of it? Some of you can think of suffering that you endured and can recognize that there was some good that came out of it. And so, just think about that. Job 23 verse 10 says, but He knows the way that I take. When He has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. That was Job's mindset. Even though there's suffering that Job endures, he's being tested. What's the end result? He's going to come forth as gold. There's a molding process that's taking place, and he's going to get better as a result of that. And also, no argument based on suffering can legitimately dispute the existence or nature of God. It's just I just think it's all around bad argument to hang your hat on this idea of suffering as just definitive proof that God does not exist. Or if you don't say this is proof that God doesn't exist, you use it to dispute the nature of God. And there's just many holes in that argument, at least in my eyes. That's the end of our lesson. I hope it has been beneficial to those that watch, those that will watch, and we'll, as always, continue to have these lessons. Try to have them on Sunday. Sometimes I'm not able to do that, but we also upload these videos on YouTube. We upload them to our Facebook page, our YouTube page, North Columbus Church of Christ, and you can see that we have our past lessons that are being stored there. And so, again, even if we are not live, leave a question or comment here. I'll get to it, hopefully, if I see it, or leave a question or comment on our YouTube page. Again, thanks for watching. See you next time.